That's one of the reasons we have these webinars. We also do it to meet you and learn more about you, and most of all, to highlight the issues that our guests are working on and make connections there. And I really hope, since this is a quite new and relevant area for planning and using form-based codes, that we can start a new discussion around this that might develop into something more, I hope. So stay tuned for that. I do want to give a little background. This is the agenda for today. We're going to talk a little bit about inCitu and who we are. I'm going to introduce Alan to talk about Kauai, and then talk about this amazing project that they're working on there. And then we'll talk about inCitu and how it's being used in that project later on, and give you all a chance to ask any questions you want, not just about technology, but about wildfires and resilience in general. So inCitu, we are a startup based here in New York City. We started 4 years ago, founded by our Donna Chairman, who is with us today, is an architect and urban data scientist. And what we're all about is really bringing the future, the conversation that happens around the future of cities, to life by taking urban planning information and complex spatial proposals and putting them on the street in the real context inCitu, so that we can talk about the future at eye level, the way that we intuitively talk about cities. We do this with planners and planning departments. We do it with architecture firms, and we do it with community advocates, and provide this platform for people to publish ideas and talk about them this way. So we use mobile technology, so smartphones and tablets, not glasses and visors, because not only is it more accessible to what people have in their pockets today, but it's also very intuitive, and it puts it in your hands so you have control. And most of all, it's empowering in being able to share that view with everyone around you and over your shoulder, and have sort of a group experience. This is what the process looks like on the street when you can scan and see a project in its actual location. And we've been doing this for a little while, and now we have this platform where you can publish projects yourself by dragging a model on a 3D map and creating this proposal that you can share in this way, and enhance the conversations that you're having on tours and pop-ups and meetings. So I'm going to turn over the screen share to Alan to make an introduction. And I had one question for Alan. I'll let you self-introduce yourself, Alan, but I have one question for you as someone we've worked with and seen at a lot of conferences around technology and planning. What are the types of problems that you've had to work on that made you a planner that is so engaged with emerging technology and this 3D technology that you use?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much, Nick. So just to get started, let me go ahead and share my screen here. I will move this into presenter view. All right, can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
All righty. So my name is Alan Clinton. I'm the administrative planning officer here for the County of Kauai. If you ever want to learn a little bit more about me, I recommend you watch season 3 of Bridgerton. There's a character who I was told, I've never watched the show, but I was told by about 6 people independently that this person looks like me, acts like me, talks like me. And apparently it's a great way to learn more about me without actually meeting me. And as
Anyone get it?
and as my as sort of Nick indicated, I am the administrative planning officer at the County of Kauai, and I always love sharing that title because it never communicates anything about my actual job to hardly anyone. But in short, I work on special projects at the nexus of long range and regulatory planning. And to address Nick's question right off, the reason why we've really started to engage and use some of these tools, new tools and technologies, is just because the complexity of our challenges from the standpoint of hazard mitigation and resiliency really demand and dictate that we take a much more proactive approach to communication and dialogue, and really understanding that threading the needle from a policy, political, and legal standpoint takes a lot of creativity and new types of tools to communicate not only to the public, but to stakeholders as well as politicians. The 2 models that you see are just other examples I've used inCitu for in the past, trying to communicate what it could look like to show a different structure in different locations, as well as some of our bus shelters. But the reason why we are here today, though, is to talk through a a zoning amendment package that we are moving forward with that just actually cleared our planning commission on Tuesday, to bring in a lot of the best practices associated with fire science into a part of our community here on Kauai. I'm really excited to be joining you all because this is actually my first public presentation on this subject, because for the longest time we've been working with different technocrats, bureaucrats, people, and the public about how to develop this. But now everything is public record, and we kind of can start talking about these items in a as they relate to what's currently publicly available. So many people who are familiar with the fire science space will be, I think, interested to see what we're proposing and moving forward with here. Um, we've been doing a lot of learning over the last couple of years, but what part of this ordinance entails home hardening, defensible space, vegetation management, community cleanup, emergency access and easement requirements, and mandatory home assessments. This isn't island-wide at the moment. It's in particular relation to a couple of our communities on the west side of Kauai, which are very hazard prone. And before I get started, I do want to provide some thank yous. We've been working pretty closely with folks at Headwater Economics, at the Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization, as well as the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, to really ground truth and test a lot of these requirements in what we'll be presenting to you today. And of course, our County of Kauai Ohana here, my boss, the planning director, Kaina Hall, my fellow planner, Shlea Koga, and of course, Mayor Kawakami. And this is a slide I really like to share before giving some presentations, especially when we're talking about cross disciplinary items. It's great to have data as an analyst, as a urbanist, as a ruralist. We can sort our data, arrange it, and visualize it, but until we can kind of organize it to tell a story, sometimes it's hard to cross the different disciplines. And it's very clear that the discussion about fire mitigation does require us to go a little bit out of our standard playbook, rulebook, or area to try to create a compelling vision for the future. And so the first, as this is a focus on augmented reality technology, and as we're going through this presentation, I would invite you all to try out this model we've put together to describe some of the vegetation management zones that we are proposing. And in short, we're realizing through communication with fire science professionals that that first 0 to 5 feet is some of the most important area that we can keep clear of debris, of combustible material. And so this is one of the models that we've put together to start communicating some of those regulations.
Yeah, just a technical note, Alan.
Sure.
We have some models in the presentation today, which you can scan with QR code. You may encounter some issues if you're on the Android platform in particular, with some issues we've had this week. And so if you normally you do not have to download our native app, but if you look for the inCitu native app on your Play Store, your App Store, and download that, and if you're having any issues, that is one way that you may have some luck in being more successful at viewing the projects. We have our team, Sydney, in the chat here. So if anyone has any issues viewing the augmented reality, just put a note in the chat, and Sydney will hop into a direct message to assist you with that.
Awesome. Thank you, Nick. So I'll go back one slide here just to kind of reiterate. So this is really a story that we're going to present today about policy development and an approach to incorporate fire mitigation standards into our regulatory framework to inform how we grow, and in particular, how we are using inCitu to help communicate this new planning paradigm. As I briefly mentioned already, we're going to introduce the zoning package and those models, provide the context of Kauai, fires in the context of Hawaii and at a larger scale as well. What we've been learning along the way as we've going through the policy development process, and we're going to backtrack a little bit to discuss a form-based code as a policy vessel and how we're modifying that a little bit into a fire-based code to achieve the goals that we have set out for. So I will skip up to here. So those of you who are not familiar with Kauai and Hawaii in general, this is the state of Hawaii in the North Central Pacific. The County of Kauai is the smallest county within the state of Hawaii. We have about 75,000 residents, and the County of Kauai includes the island of Kauai, Niihau, Lehua, and Ka'ula. However, what we're discussing today is predominantly all focused on the island of Kauai. The rest of the islands are predominantly uninhabited or by a very small group of native Hawaiian families who still live over on Niihau. Um, as you're probably aware, the Lahaina fires that sparked a lot of discussion about fire here in Hawaii occurred over in Maui County, over on the island of Maui, where I'm circling right now. Kauai is a rural geography. It was the sort of backdrop for Lilo and Stitch. I think the movie just came out, so that was just a coincidence. But anyway, um, it's a fantastic rural community. The west side of Kauai, because of a rain shadow, tends to be categorized as a desert. Something people very regularly forget about the Hawaiian Islands is that the western side of the islands tend to be very dry just due to physical geography, rain shadow effect. Um, and while there is a rural characteristic in nature, I'd actually probably direct you to the movie Yellow or to the show Yellowstone. The dynamics between many of the characters and groups within that show are actually much more emblematic of here on Kauai. We certainly don't have the gun violence, shooting, and death, but the relationship between the Kanaka Maoli, the native people here in Hawaii, long-term local residents, the millionaire and billionaire class, and tourism kind of reflect many of the tensions that we work through here on the islands. Um, for the last couple of years, we've really been focusing on sea level rise, bringing in predictive models into our regulatory framework to help prepare our communities for the hazards of the 21st century. And then Lahaina happened. Lahaina was a pretty transformational event to occur here, and really opened up our eyes as planners. Um, and over the last 2 years, reports have been coming out from the Attorney General's office and other folks about who's to blame, what things can be improved. And we were kind of interested because some blame was certainly put at the hands of planners as far as not being mindful of access routes, subdivision ordinances, density, the relationship of building to building setbacks. But the reports didn't go as far as we would have liked as far as giving us recommendations and what to move forward with. And so we had to do a little bit more learning. On Kauai, we had an instance where we had a fire occur on the west side of Kauai right next to one of our rural communities that almost burnt to the ground last year in July, following what happened in Lahaina. And so this really kickstarted our conversations. And the thing that is amazing about this photo is you can just see the relationship between agricultural lands that are fallow and the ones that are actively managed and how they functioned as fire breaks. But the fire literally wound its way between actively managed fields, and we almost lost this entire community here on Kauai. This is this is Kamakani Camp. And on Kauai, we have these communities that are known as plantation camp communities. These are communities adjacent to agricultural lands that were set up associated with the sugar plantation era here in Hawaii. But these communities still exist today, but they are also very vulnerable. But they're some of the most precious and remarkable communities that we have here on Kauai. And we've realized that not only do we want to allow them to continue to exist, but to grow and maintain their characteristics. Then the LA fires happened. Um, and we we had to do some more learning. We realized and we learned from many of the folks who were discussing this subject is that even with a borderline like militarized experienced firefighting force that they have in California, they could not stop the destruction. And so we realized this was not necessarily just we need more equipment. There is a role that we as planners need to be more mindful of as we start preparing our communities for fire risk. And so my boss took me and 10 of our other planners to the Fire Chiefs Wildland Urban Interface Conference in Kansas City about a couple months ago. And these are my big notes on the far left. And this is what happens when I do so much learning at a conference where you write stuff down, but then you have to highlight certain things that are even more important. Then you put them in boxes also. But it brought a whole bunch of additional questions. What does the science tell us about about how to restrict structure to structure fires? How does the planning profession display leadership? Should we step out of our lane? Is fire mitigation a system, or are there parts of the best practices that we can still tinker with while still being effective to reduce fire risk? What are the cheapest parts to implement? What will our building industry say? Can we use a form-based code as a policy vessel and use it to discuss fire mitigation and plan for fire hazards? And if we adopt these changes, that going to change the characteristic of our community. So these were really big questions that we needed to figure out and learn a bit more. And as we were crafting an ordinance, we realized that we needed to kind of identify additional communication tools to try to understand, scenario plan, and see what are the ideal solutions. And so this is really where inCitu comes back into play. This is just a photo of us at the conference. We have our subdivision planner, our 3 regulatory planners, 3 enforcement planners, myself, and our boss. And this is where we were starting to draft our code. And now I'm going to kind of give a little bit of an overview of what a form-based code is and where we're moving. But conventional zoning design guidelines, and form-based codes are very different methods for planning your community. And what we were finding through our long-range planning processes is that our communities were telling us that there are certain areas that were very special to them. But those places, we had not built another one in the last 50 to 70 years because our zoning codes never really allowed for it. And so a form-based code was a tool that we implemented and adopted here on Kauai so that we could perpetuate the type of form and character of our communities that they were demanding. And form-based codes get into many more details related to design, building types, interaction with the street. And so this was an interesting opportunity for us to bring in fire science as well. But the way that we kind of go about this is we do very intensive data collection exercises, identify the types of structures, the types of houses, how they're organized. Um, are there urban gardens? Is there foliage that we need to be mindful of? What defines these places? From a fire science standpoint, it was exciting. We were like, oh, there's metal fences already. Fantastic. This is something we can build off of. Unfortunately, people also have outdoor carpets. That is not good for fire suppression. But these are really unique communities, and we did whatever we could to try to capture all that information so we could design a zoning framework that allowed these places to grow and build. And we ended up arriving at building types, frontage types, rear exits, and organizations of these communities into a form-based code. We started putting together models to show what these would look like using inCitu once again, and that's when our fire hit. And we realized that we have to be a very bit more thoughtful about how we plan for fire. And so the first thing that we learned, let's put a 5-foot buffer around these homes. Would that work? How do we start removing vegetation from these areas? Is that enough? And the answer was not quite. And so we've reorganized our building types from what you see on the top left to on the top to the bottom here, where we changed the foundations. We've added fire mesh. We've added requirements for Class A roofs, gutter and downspout requirements, fire mesh, and probably the most challenging element to implement is a 5-foot concrete skirt around all of the new structures that are going to be proposed as an area that is most problematic from a fire mitigation standpoint to limit risk. And so what you see here are many of the requirements that we are incorporating into planning for new growth in these areas. Everything in blue is home hardening requirements. And then the things that are in the yellows and the reds and the oranges are related to vegetation management. And so we took a lot of the regulations from some of the insurance industry texts. We took a lot of the information from building codes, from fire codes, and tried to see what was feasible within this new framework that wouldn't necessarily lead to an excessive amount of backlash. How can we work with our different stakeholders in the community? How far away from a house can I have a tea leaf? How far away can I have a tree that has branches up to 6 feet? What does that look like? And so this is a very new paradigm that we are proposing. And this is where it was very important for us to bring tools like inCitu into play such as the model that we started with, where we can show what these different zones look like in context and in scale. I dragged my coworker Chloe out to take photos with me the other day to prepare for this presentation. But this has been a really great opportunity and tool for people to understand in context and in real life how far away they are allowed to plan their vegetation, their landscaping. And so this was a really important step for us to help communicate to the large landowners that we're working with, the stakeholders, as well as the politicians who will be reviewing this information. Another example is I mentioned before that the way our ordinance is crafted is there's specific rules and regulations for the 0 to 5 feet, the 5 to 30 feet, and the 30 to 100 feet. So we wanted to make sure we also had an example of these different zones to communicate how far out vegetation management is required. And also what it looks like for accessory structures, because eventually there will be garages, other different rules apply to accessory structures compared to the main dwelling unit where people live. And so this has once again been a really important step to allow us to communicate the different scenarios that we are potentially going to be facing with these new regulations in place.
Hey, Alan, I hate to interrupt, but we have a couple of really great questions in the chat that we might want to get to before we move too far off the topic.
Perfect.
Yeah, thanks, Sydney.
So Kevin DeVito said, are you using any language learning AI models to support this, merging all the form-based code, vegetation data, canopy, temperature layers, etc.?
No. So it's been interesting, the discussion over time regarding different AI tools and different ways that we can integrate some of those pieces into as sort of support tools for this programming. Those types of things have not necessarily aided us in the development of the code, so to speak, rather than we've been working particularly with the fire science industry stakeholders, particularly on best practices, rather than necessarily doing a intense review of the like vegetation from a standpoint of like remote sensing and object identification. But there is certainly room for those tools from an implementation standpoint. So that's certainly something on the horizon.
Great. And then another question from David is, how is this information being collected? I know an increasingly common method is using an NDVI camera on drones and using said drones for 3D photogrammetry of regions. Is that something you've looked into?
Yeah, so this is a very fun subject that we could go into a lot of depth on, and I'll actually be sharing some of the additional context slides I added at the end may add some additional perspective on this. And there's a very large discussion at play regarding the fidelity of 3D models, the visual quality of 3D models, and what people need to see in order to understand a particular point. What story are we trying to communicate? What information do we want people to learn? And there is a level of detail threshold and a context threshold that sometimes can become more confusing. If you're trying to, we've run into instances where if we try to use full photorealism and a particular thing looks off, especially in an area that people are already familiar with, oftentimes it sinks their trust in the model. And creates a barrier rather than helping us move forward with learning and education. And so sometimes we've been finding, especially in this instance, using the lower level of detail models actually supports greater understanding of the information. And so that's sort of where there are, I'll show later on, there is sort of a couple of additional slides I have to show how we're bringing in additional photorealism. But this was actually very amusing and something that helped me move in this direction, maybe going even back to Nick's question earlier on. I put together the best model I possibly could of one of these structures as photorealistic as I could. And then somebody looked at it and like, what is the ideal front of this house? Here are the different options. And all they could focus on was the tree, off to the side that we weren't talking about, and they're like, that doesn't look real, the light's not coming through it, and that's not the way it moves. And so I was really trying to get them to focus on the structure and how we should maybe change different frontage types, but they couldn't get over the fact that the tree looked wrong. And so using some of these tools, I'm a huge enthusiast and advocate for, but there are still communication challenges, especially if you're trying to articulate something that looks photorealistic. It's got to be like 98% accurate before sometimes it can be a distraction.
So sometimes it makes sense to keep things simple.
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks so much for answering those questions, Alan.
Thanks,
Of
Alan.
course.
I put some guidance for folks to see the visualizations and see the AR projects in the chat. If you're having any issues, give a shout and we'll help you out. And I'll hand it back to you, Alan.
Great. So the other big element of this, and this goes back to the discussion about simplicity of this proposal and this regulation that we are moving forward with for these particular plantation camps on Kauai, is the home assessment program. And one of what we were learning as we were trying to understand everything about how to mitigate fire, the primary things we learned is that the best thing you can do, number one, is update building codes. Number two is build up community capacity, education, and knowledge about landscaping, about what can burn, how to maybe make sure that you have metal fences instead of wooden fences that hit the structure. And what we have added into this as well, into this package of zoning amendments, is a home assessment requirement and a community cleanup. Because we are working with large landowners in this instance, we will be doing annual evaluations alongside the fire department, where we will have these AR buffers that go around the structures so that people can see what is within that 5 foot 0 to 5 foot zone and what is not. And so this little square donut here is an example of a building footprint with just that 5 foot area extruded, so that anything that we can see, and this will be set to a transparency, any combustible item within that area will have to be moved or thrown away. And so this is sort of another way that we can really leverage the augmented reality technology, where we are adding additional information into the current reality that people exist in. And that's really where the power, I think, of AR comes in, is we can use our known existing context and add additional information to help communicate how these different pieces of the regulatory framework work together.
And Alan, you were telling me this isn't as much for making that final judgment or measuring and surveying. This is more for getting a quick idea of things that you might want to look at.
It would be a bit of both. This is sort of a tool to help people understand compliance, but this regulatory ordinance has teeth. If you do not, if the large landowners do not cooperate with these programs, we can fine them. And so this is kind of we doubt it will get to that point, because we want to work collectively and collaboratively with our nonprofit partners, with our community partners, with the landowners in the county planning department and our enforcement program. But the goal here is to increase learning and understanding in a very straightforward way for our homeowners, our large landowners and land managers, as well as our enforcement folks. And this was a really quick win, so to speak, from a visualization standpoint, to use inCitu as a way to wrap a buffer around a house with known dimensions. And then you can easily say, nope, this needs to go, this doesn't, and make it very clear and transparent.
That's super interesting. It's a kind of thing that I don't think we could have ever imagined starting out being used for something like this. And it's so simple, visually too. Interesting.
Yeah, it's funny, because I imagine this little example here is probably going to be used more than any of the other more complex models that we showed. And so now also kind of expanding back out, and this, I think, David, goes back to your question. So once again, especially now knowing that we have we want to achieve sort of thematic and model parity between all of the different tools and visualization practices that we have. And so it was very nice that with inCitu, we can use the GLB file format type that also works very well with things like ArcGIS Urban and their direct 3D file upload update that they just provided. We're able to take those same models, add some color, add some context, and show what the distribution of houses would look like with these new setback requirements, with these new vegetation requirements. There's a couple, this visualization here is designed to show what it currently looks like, but we can do some basic scenario planning and indicate which elements of foliage are no longer compatible. We can do that at a much more granular scale and look at the different frontages of these structures. And even bring it into things like the Unreal Engine, and this is through the UrbanXR beta with ArcGIS Urban. And going back to the discussion about photorealism, these are the two species that we are most worried about here in Hawaii, on Kauai in particular. This is haole and guinea grass. And I've been doing tests of these models with our stakeholders, with our community partners, and our fire chiefs and our firefighters, and they all thought this was real, but it's rather just a collection of 3D objects of very high quality and fidelity that we are going to be using as we move a little bit more forward down the level of detail track, particularly for new areas that growth will occur. This kind of goes back to the comment I had before. AR is even more valuable when you can provide additional context to places that already exist, especially if they're known places that people already have so much familiarity with. And so we're trying to really strike the balance between when it's best to use augmented reality tools, when it's best to use VR tools, and additional types of extended reality to communicate this kind of programmatic paradigm. So with that, I think that's a good place to wrap up. I really want to thank everybody for their attention today and for joining. And if there's any questions that you folks have about our approach, the methodology, and how we're trying to incorporate fire mitigation into some of our known planning tools, please feel free to reach out, and I would be more than happy to continue this conversation. We currently just passed through our planning commission with this regulatory ordinance, and it will be moving forward through our council over the next 2 months. So please stay tuned, and we'll be happy to do a follow-up later on.
Alan, first of all, congratulations. I hope folks have some more questions and want to stay on. We're here for the top of the hour. I've got a couple of my own about the ordinance, and I think it's just, first of all, congratulations. It's amazing. I haven't heard of anything like this before. And I'll ask one question first, which is, how did you talked the other day about using this at a very small scale? Like this is a plan that's focused on one particular community. It's almost a neighborhood scale code. And so what is the importance of working at that scale, do you think? And how might that not scale up or maybe scale across if you're trying to bring this to other areas?
So awesome question. And the answer is, the goal is that the entirety of Kauai is prepared to handle the hazards of the 21st century. And just because we know certain areas of Kauai are more wet than others, are still susceptible to drought. And eventually we would like to move forward with an island-wide wildland urban interface regulatory program. But it's so critical for us to get our feet wet in a community where we can do really heavy deep dives and try to figure out what are the things that resonate most with our building industry. Do people have difficulty keeping that 5 feet clear, that area that's concreted out? That may change the way people navigate around their structures. It'll be interesting to hear how that goes. At the same time, it also becomes more ADA accessible. Is that something more people are going to want and ask for? So there's a whole lot of additional questions that we are hoping to learn from this type of intervention, and realize that each community may have its specific needs, but from this we can really pick and choose what are the things that are most achievable, most implementable, and enforceable with our current resources so that we can right size and scale, sort of as you mentioned, most appropriately. And I have a lot of hope that, especially with these new tools that we have access to, in particular, if we do need to do an island-wide wildland urban interface type mapping exercise, we will resort back to some of those tools that David had mentioned in his question, that require a little bit more sort of remote sensing, machine learning, and kind of computer vision type applications to help us understand where these different types of regulations are most appropriate here on the island.
Yeah, David had another question in the chat about is Google providing Street View images on Kauai yet, and have they updated them after fires?
Story of my life in a rural locality. Um, I don't think our Google Street View has been updated since like 2011. And this is kind of an interesting conversation, as I would call myself a rural planner, not an urban planner. Very regularly, data sets that are presented for the United States oftentimes do not include the more rural areas, and particularly areas in Hawaii, Alaska, and other sort of remote geographies. So it becomes a bit of a challenge because we oftentimes also don't have much budget to purchase those additional services. Um, and that's an interesting, there's a whole different conversation we could have on that front. Particularly as this code was drafted fully in-house with the support of nonprofit and community partners.
Someone in the chat says they checked and there was an update in May from Google Street View. I wonder where that's for. It's cool since that also supports how our AR works on location too. Better Street View imagery, better position.
We heard there was that there would be some on island, so I'm not sure if it's been fully updated yet, but I'll certainly be checking.
Cool. So I had another question about the communication across disciplines between firefighters, planners, and the planning board or planning commissions, which are not generally professional planners or architects on those boards, but informed locals. So what were some what were the new terms that you learned through this process? I'm thinking about what you said about Ember. What was it?
So a lot of the items that the home hardening components with the fire mesh, with the concrete skirt, the Class A roof, a lot of that is to limit the ember intrusion. So very small flaming objects that can fly very far ahead of a fire underneath heavy wind conditions. Oftentimes those embers sit and land right next to houses, little eddies form right around the base of structures, and oftentimes they land on roofs. And so we were very cognizant that the mass majority of the things that we're proposing here are designed to limit ember intrusion, knowing full well that sort of the things that were most cost effective aren't the things that necessarily, the things that are most effective to limit fire. We're trying to find the ones that were also most cost effective, and that's really where we've hit a middle ground. We would love it if we could have fire rated walls for all of these structures, but that increases the cost of a structure by about 20%. And so we tested it out here. Fire rated walls would add about $150,000 in cost to some of these structures, and that really wouldn't be feasible. But the interventions we described here, metal roofs, concrete blocking for foundation, the concrete, that'll probably add 10 to $5,000 to $10,000, maybe about 12. And so that we figured was a bit more manageable for our more susceptible communities. And the other conversation I haven't brought up once yet is the insurance markets.
Yeah.
That is the other big conversation, that we are seeing insurers leave Hawaii very rapidly. And it's very likely, as that continues to occur, we will struggle even more with our affordable housing challenges if people who require mortgages are unable to get insurance, and just exacerbate some of those problems. And so while we never want to add additional costs and regulations onto our development community and our homeowners, we feel it's very challenging not to take action in this instance, knowing full well that the insurance markets are evaluating our building behaviors quite clearly.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So the form-based code, do you think would make insurers more confident in continuing to support folks there?
We're hoping so. I wish I could had a better answer for that. Every time I go to a conference, I try to learn more about the insurance industry and how these markets are formed, um, what the relationship is between their data collection efforts, what we propose. Um, we've seen some discussions surrounding, now that we have our sea level rise constraint district in, how people handle insurance associated with flooding and ocean related hazards. We're hoping that we can move forward with those discussions regarding fire mitigation. If we prepare many of our communities in this manner, we're hoping that the insurers will still feel confident to insure properties here.
I'll ask you, I think the toughest question I asked you when we were talking yesterday, which is that what, not necessarily for this area, but we've seen with recent fires in other places, including California, the question arises, should we rebuild back in some of these places if they become uninhabitable or uninsurable in the same ways that we've been building? And so when that question comes up, the question arises like, what do you do as a planner? And then what would you do as a resident as that reality starts to sink in?
So yeah, this is certainly a really challenging subject, and I would once again probably first pull from our work in sort of learning more about managed retreat from sea level rise. Throughout the entire world, there's been, as we've been surveying how different communities handle retreat from coastlines, there's kind of two elements here: the human psychological challenge of identity with place and relocation. Until people see the actual hazard, even if we know it will maybe occur in 20 to 30 years, if not longer, until they actually see that hazard affecting their property and structure, it's very challenging to get people to move willingly. And so in the second part is, legally in the United States of America, private property rights are very powerful. And oftentimes, even if we have information and data where we can do a very good job to predict future challenges with hazards, we can't strip people of all of their development rights without compensating them for their losses. In Hawaii, that becomes very costly very quickly. And so the regulations that we are proposing here are all about how people can accommodate living with these hazards and adapt to living with these hazards going forward, knowing full well that we don't necessarily have the psychological, political, or social capital to wholesale, or financial capital to wholesale relocate communities out of hazardous locations. Um, and this is the very large discussion that we have regularly about climate change hazards and future risks, and the role that we can play using the best information, the best data, and whether or not we're allowed to use forward-looking tools like predictive models to require behavior change, or even information about urban heat. Can we use those to require behavior change? And that's a very tricky legal subject that we could talk about for another 3 hours. But I think we'll maybe wait till our next conference.
Yeah, it seems clear storytelling communication rather than anything we think we already know is the way forward and through uncertainty. I guess I will leave you with one more question before we close out today, which is really about, this is like a really new thing that you're trying. What lessons have you learned so far would you have to share with other folks in other communities? And we've had folks from all around the world in here working in the same area. So what would you tell others about things that you've learned, and how might we collaborate across places to explore this theme further?
So unfortunately, the recommendation I have is probably the most resource intensive, and is that we did the form-based code process, the development process, plus then adding in these fire elements. We did our first data collection effort for that new Milla camp that I displayed about 3.5 years ago. And we've been doing a very intensive deep dive into one particular community and neighborhood to collect all of this information so that hopefully we can learn from that experience and apply it to other places throughout our island communities. Um, but it once again comes back to the discussion of scale, the localization of the peculiarities associated with each community, and being mindful of that. We now have a lot more sophisticated data collection tools that I think we can obtain that granularity that we need to make informed decisions. But I would not lie that this took an exceedingly substantial amount of resources tailored and or focused particularly on one area that sometimes you may not have the luxury to do in other municipalities and locations where this may seem like we're providing unfair resources from a government standpoint on one particular location, rather than doing an island-wide approach for these measures. So hopefully, I guess to answer the question is it'd be great if we could share what we've learned in this incredibly intensive deep dive exercise into these particular communities and see if we can right size and fit those lessons learned to the other communities throughout the state and the nation, and hopefully abroad as well. And when I mentioned abroad, it's always interesting to reflect on this, is that these regulations and what we're proposing are so specifically tailored and ingrained to our local policy and legal framework. Sometimes they can be really challenging to translocate. I gave a presentation about sea level rise, takings, eminent domain to a group in Fiji about sea level rise, and it was just ironic because it worked for us here because we have a very specific legal framework we have to operate within. It may not always be translatable, and so I think this is the recommendation I give to most people who are trying to move in this direction is the next person you hire doesn't need to be a resource or technical analyst. My recommendation is the next person you hire is an attorney.
Very interesting and great insight about the resource intensivity of working at the neighborhood scale, but also the value there. And perhaps one way to provide value across places would be maybe an evaluative framework to help focus that decision about where to put those resources first through like an equity lens as well, and stuff like that. So I don't know. I hope that other folks listening in will be in touch and start some conversations, because we've had some similar conversations around this topic with folks as far away as Australia, and it's really interesting to see how that's developing. I'm humbled and really excited that our tool could play a part in your process of developing this piece of code, and also the conversations that you're having across like really different disciplines. So thanks once again for joining us today. Alan Clinton, our guest from the County of Kauai Planning Office, and it's really great to have all of you here joining us again today. I will leave, if you can go to the next slide, leave everybody with a link to our handbook, which is called Augmented Reality for Public Engagement. These are real lessons we've learned from working with clients like Alan about how to integrate augmented reality into your community engagement. And successful public engagement is a layering of many different tools, many different activations. And this shows how AR can fit within that to actually support and enhance what you're doing. So give it a read, and we hope you'll reach out to us and try inCitu for yourself. Thanks so much again for joining, and we'll see you at the next one.